She has never once made this family proud. Not once. My mother's voice didn't rise above a conversational level, but it carried across every corner of the Dunbar Community Hall, like she'd said it through a microphone. The room went still the way rooms only go still when something genuinely cruel has just been performed in public. 47 people. My father's retirement dinner. And she'd chosen this moment, this crowd, this room, to say out loud what she'd been saying in private for 23 years. Then she turned to the man beside her, Dr. Harlan Voss, chief of cardiothoracic surgery at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto, a man whose name appeared on plaques in 3 provinces, and she rested her hand on his forearm the way a woman rests her hand on something she considers hers. Now this, she said, sweeping her gaze across the room like she was conducting an orchestra, this is the kind of person this family should be celebrating. A real doctor, not whatever Rowan decided to become. My aunt laughed. My uncle raised his glass half an inch in agreement. My mother's best friend, who had known me since I was 7 years old and had watched me grow up in that house, looked away. I was standing in the second row, in the blazer I'd ironed that morning, in a hotel room 2 blocks from the hall, the identification badge from the Public Health Agency of Canada still clipped to the lapel because I'd forgotten to take it off in the car. And Dr. Harlan Voss, the man my mother had just held up as the standard I would never meet, had stopped smiling. He was looking at that badge. His expression didn't shift gradually. It dropped, fast, the way composure drops when a person recognizes something they were not prepared to encounter. He leaned forward slightly, reading the title beneath my name, and when he looked up, his face had gone a different color entirely. In a voice the entire table could hear, he said, "You're the one who built the Northern Corridor model." But before I tell you what that sentence cost my mother in front of every person she had spent a decade carefully managing, and who in that room finally understood what I had actually been doing for the last 8 years, hit that like button and stay with me. Because what happened next was the one outcome she had never once prepared for. My mother had been planning this dinner for 6 weeks. I know this because my father mentioned it on the phone in early October. The same call where he told me he was retiring after 31 years as a civil engineer with the city of Ottawa, and that my mother had already booked the hall, arranged the catering, selected the seating chart. She had chosen Dunbar Hall specifically because it seated 50 and had a small raised platform at the front, and my mother had never once in her life hosted an event without a raised platform. I flew in from Vancouver on a Thursday. I had 3 days of field debriefs before I could leave, 2 pending reports sitting in my work queue, and a presentation I was supposed to give the following Monday to the Federal Advisory Panel on infectious disease containment in remote northern communities. I landed at Ottawa International at 11:15 at night, took a cab to the hotel my mother had not offered to help me book, ironed my blazer, and went to sleep. She called at 7 the next morning to tell me not to wear anything that looked too clinical. I told her I'd wear the navy blazer. She said she hoped I wasn't planning to talk about my work all night because not everyone finds that interesting. I told her I wasn't planning to talk about my work at all. What I did not tell her, what I had never once told her in 8 years, was what my work actually was. To my mother, I was a government employee, a bureaucrat, someone who had chosen public health policy over medicine, which in her vocabulary meant I had chosen the waiting room over the operating theater. She had wanted a physician. She would have accepted a lawyer. She had raised me in a house in Rockcliffe Park in Ottawa, where the currency of social standing was professional designation, and I had handed her something she could not display at a dinner party. I had a PhD in epidemiological modeling from the University of Toronto. I was a senior researcher at the Public Health Agency of Canada. For the last 4 years, I had been the lead architect of what the agency internally called the Northern Corridor Project, a disease surveillance and containment framework covering 43 remote and Indigenous communities across Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Northern Ontario. Communities that had historically received outbreak notifications days or weeks after southern populations. Communities where a respiratory illness that would be a manageable inconvenience in Toronto could and did become a catastrophic event. The model I had built changed the notification timeline from an average of 11 days to under 36 hours. My mother did not know any of this. She had never asked. The first time I understood exactly how she had categorized me, I was 11 years old. My father's colleague had come for dinner, a professor from Carleton, and he had asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up. I told him I wanted to study how diseases spread, how you could map an outbreak before it reached a city. He had leaned forward, genuinely interested, started asking me questions. My mother had interrupted from the kitchen doorway. She means she wants to work in a hospital, like a normal person. She said it with a smile so the professor would think she was joking. She was not joking. I learned the difference between those two things very early in that house. The second time, I was 16, and I had won a provincial science award for a paper I had written modeling the transmission patterns of a hypothetical influenza strain through 3 interconnected school populations. The award came with a small cash prize and an invitation to present at a regional conference. My mother read the certificate, set it down on the counter, and said, "If you put this much effort into your chemistry marks, you might actually get into medical school." Then she went back to the stove. I did not cry. I had learned by then that displaying anything that looked like hurt in front of her was the same as handing her a tool she would use again. My father was different. He was always different. He was a quiet man, Edouard Marlowe. He had grown up in Gatineau in a French-speaking household, crossed the river for university, built a career in municipal engineering that was unglamorous by my mother's standards and completely essential by any reasonable measure of how a city functions. He designed flood mitigation systems. He kept basements dry. He was enormously proud of this and had no patience for the idea that work needed an audience to have value. When I came home with the provincial science certificate and found it on the counter where she had left it, he came into my room that evening, sat on the edge of the desk chair, and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, in the particular way he had of making a statement sound like the most obvious thing in the world, "The people who map the problems are just as important as the people who treat them. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." He picked up the certificate, carried it downstairs, and put it in a frame on the wall of his home office. It was still there the last time I visited. He was the one who drove me to the bus station when I left for Toronto at 18. He was the one who called every Sunday during my first year of graduate school, not to ask about my grades, but to ask what I was working on, what I was discovering, what surprised me that week. He was the one who, when I called him from a field site in Northern Ontario at 2 in the morning, because a community of 300 people had just reported a cluster of cases that looked wrong in the way that things only look wrong when something serious is beginning, stayed on the phone with me for an hour while I worked through the early data, asking questions the way an engineer asks questions, systematic, structural, without panic. He was the reason I was at that retirement dinner, not my mother, him. When I walked into Dunbar Hall that evening, she was already at the front near the platform, directing the catering staff with the focused energy of a woman who had been rehearsing this moment in her mind for weeks. She saw me, assessed the blazer, assessed the badge I hadn't removed, and said, "You look tired. Is that what you've been wearing all day?" I said hello to my father instead. He was standing near the back of the room, talking to his former supervisor, a man named Aldous, who had to be nearly 80, and who shook my hand for a long time and said he had heard I was doing important work. I thanked him. My father looked at me the way he had always looked at me at moments like that, quietly, like he was registering something he already knew. My mother had arranged the seating with the precision of someone who had thought carefully about what each arrangement communicated. She and Dr. Voss were at the front table with my aunt and uncle and 2 of my parents' oldest friends. I had been placed at a side table near the back, between a retired colleague of my father's whose hearing aid kept whistling, and my cousin, who is 17, and had spent most of the pre-dinner hour looking at his phone. I noted the seating chart, noted my position on it, and found a space near the back wall where I could see the full room. My mother had been collecting Dr. Voss for 3 years. She had met him at a charity gala, determined his professional status within the first conversation, and had been engineering reasons to mention his name in family context ever since. He was not unkind. He was a competent surgeon by all accounts and a perfectly civil dinner guest. What he was, in my mother's framework, was an exhibit. Evidence that medicine was the pinnacle, that the family could be associated with genuine prestige, that whatever I had chosen to do instead was the lesser path. She introduced him that evening with the rehearsed warmth of a person unveiling something they are very proud to own. She described his research, his hospital appointments, the award he had received from the Canadian Medical Association. She said his name twice in the first minute. When she finished, the room applauded, and she smiled the smile of a woman who has successfully demonstrated a point. Then she turned toward me. Just slightly. Just enough. She has never once made this family proud. Not once. The room didn't go loud. It went the other kind. The kind where 47 people suddenly become very interested in their water glasses. My aunt started to say something that dissolved before it became words. My uncle's hand stopped midway to his wine. Across the table, my father's expression moved through something I recognized, the particular compression around the eyes he used when he was choosing silence, because the alternative was a confrontation he had been unable to win in 34 years of marriage. I had known she might say something. I had not known she would say it like that, in those words, at this specific moment, with the directness of someone who had finally decided the private version of this opinion needed a public airing. My right hand moved to my phone in my jacket pocket. Not a conscious decision. Muscle memory from years of fieldwork, from every situation where documentation became necessary before you fully understood why. I pressed record. Whatever came next, I had it. Then I looked at Dr. Voss. His eyes were on my badge, his mouth was open slightly, not in a social way, in the way of a person whose processing system has encountered something it wasn't ready for. He read the full title, Senior Research Scientist, Epidemiological Systems, Public Health Agency of Canada. He looked at the small line beneath it, the project designation I hadn't bothered to cover. NCP Federal, Northern Corridor Project, Federal Lead. He looked up. His voice was not loud, but it was clear and it had no performance in it at all. You're the one who built the Northern Corridor model. My father set down his fork. The sound it made on the plate was small, but in that particular silence it arrived like a signal. My mother's smile did not disappear immediately. It took a second, which was almost worse, the half-beat where it held in place before the information behind her eyes caught up with what was happening in the room. She recovered the way she always recovered. Quickly, smoothly, with a redirect so practiced it should have been invisible. Oh, Harlan, don't encourage her. She works in an office. It's all very theoretical. Nobody moved. Not my uncle, not my aunt, not the retired colleague with the whistling hearing aid, who had turned in his chair and was watching the front of the room with the focused attention of a man who has been waiting a long time to see how something turns out. Dr. Voss did not redirect. He did not glance at my mother for cues. He squared himself in a way that had nothing social about it, and spoke the way I imagined he spoke in a room full of residents when the diagnosis had just changed and everyone needed to recalibrate. The Northern Corridor model is not theoretical. It is the most significant advancement in remote community disease surveillance in Canada in the last 20 years. He paused. One breath. I know this because 3 of my colleagues at St. Michael's were part of the federal consultation panel when it was implemented. I know this because last February, there was a respiratory outbreak in a fly-in community in Northern Ontario that would have gone undetected for 2 weeks under the old system. Under the Northern Corridor framework, the alert went out in 29 hours. We had a containment team on the ground before secondary transmission reached the school. He looked at me, and then back at the room. I don't know how many people that prevented from becoming critically ill, but I know what late-stage respiratory illness looks like in a community with no hospital within 400 kilometers. So I have some sense of what the number might be. My aunt's phone went face down on the table. My uncle lowered his glass the rest of the way. At the far end of the front table, my mother sat with her hands in her lap, and her expression assembled into something neutral, something that would have read as composed to anyone who hadn't spent 30 years learning how to read her face. I had spent 30 years learning how to read her face. She had not known. That was the piece she would find hardest. She had not known what I had built, because she had never asked, and she had never asked because she had already decided the answer wasn't worth knowing. I did not say anything yet. There are disciplines I learned in fieldwork that have no official name but are completely essential. One of them is the discipline of letting a room finish arriving at a conclusion before you speak into it. A room needs time to fully understand what it has just heard. Speaking too soon fills the silence before the information can settle. I let it settle. Dr. Voss was not finished. I want to say one more thing, he said, and there was a quality in his voice that had shifted slightly, something quieter but more certain. I'm at a hospital. I see patients. I fix the problem in front of me. What your daughter does, what this model does, is prevent the problem from becoming a patient in the first place. He looked around the table with the directness of a man who had spent decades delivering news to families and had no remaining patience for softening things that didn't need to be soft. That is not a lesser kind of medicine. That is the kind that saves the most lives. My retired neighbor at the side table started to clap. Just him at first. Then the retired colleague beside me. Then, slowly, the rest of the room. Not the energetic applause of celebration. The quieter kind, the kind that means something more specific has been recognized. My mother looked at her own hands. I am not going to tell you there was a single clean moment where everything in that room resolved. Real life doesn't work that way, and anyone who has sat inside a version of that kind of gathering knows that the reversal of a 20-year narrative doesn't happen in one speech, no matter how accurate the speech is. But I will tell you this. My uncle did not meet my eyes for the rest of the evening. Not once. This is the same man who had spent years telling my father's colleagues, at events exactly like this one, that his niece had gone into government in the tone people use when they mean someone opted out of real ambition. Who knew my publication record? Who had access to the same public information everyone else is in that industry had access to? Who had chosen, every time, to endorse my mother's version of me because it was easier and more convenient than the alternative? My aunt picked up her phone and put it in her purse and did not take it out again. She had been recording. I had seen her angle it toward me when my mother spoke. She had stopped recording the moment the room shifted, because she only ever documented what was useful to the narrative, and the narrative had just changed. My father, at the end of the evening, walked over to the side table where I was still sitting, put his hand briefly on my shoulder, and said nothing. He didn't need to. I had been fluent in his particular dialect of silence since I was about 8 years old, and what it meant in that moment was, I always knew, and I am sorry she made you carry it this long. He looked more tired than the last time I had seen him. Smaller in some way I couldn't entirely define. The retirement made sense now in a way it hadn't when he'd told me on the phone. He was done, not just from the job, he was done with the weight of that house in a way that had been building for a long time. 3 weeks later, I drove to Ottawa again, not for an event, just to see him. We sat in his home office, the room where the provincial science certificate was still framed on the wall, and drank tea and talked for 3 hours about hydrology and outbreak vectors, and what I thought would happen with northern infrastructure over the next decade. He asked questions the way he had always asked questions, systematically, without pretense, because he was genuinely interested in the answers. My mother came in once, stood in the doorway for a moment, and left without saying anything. That was when I understood something that I had been circling around for most of my adult life without landing on directly. The approval I had spent my 20s quietly angling toward, the version of this relationship I had kept drafting in the back of my mind, where she finally asked a real question, and I finally gave a real answer, and something between us became something it had never been, that version had passed its window. It hadn't closed dramatically, it had simply expired, the way things expire when you don't get to them in time. This is not the same as not caring. I want to be clear about that. The absence of hope is not the same as indifference. You can understand that something is over and still feel the weight of what it could have been. Those two things exist at the same time without canceling each other out. What I did, in the months after that dinner, was stop organizing my life around the gap. I stopped framing my choices in relation to her disapproval. I stopped rehearsing the conversation where she finally understood what I did and why it mattered. I let that conversation go, the same way you let go of a frequency you've been trying to reach that has never once transmitted back. The Northern Corridor project was expanded in the spring. We added 6 new communities in Nunavut. I hired 2 new researchers and spent 4 months in the field running calibration assessments on the updated alert system. I presented our 2-year outcomes data to the Federal Health Committee in June, in a building 7 blocks from my parents' house. I did not tell my mother I was in town. What I told my father was everything. I called him from the hotel the night before the presentation, walked him through the data the way I always had, listened to him ask about the engineering constraints of remote data transmission the way an engineer would, made him laugh when I described the particular challenge of building a reliable alert system in a region where the nearest cell tower is sometimes a 3-hour flight away. He said before we hung up, "Your grandmother would have understood exactly what you built and why. She was the same kind of thinker." His mother. She had died when I was 4 and I had only photographs, but I had always held on to that as a piece of inheritance that fit in a way other things hadn't. I told him I'd call him after the presentation. He said he'd be waiting. What I want to tell you, if you are someone who has sat in a version of that room, at a version of that table, on the wrong side of a family's seating chart, not because of anything you did, but because of who you chose to be and whether it matched the shape they had already decided your life should take, is that the accounting does not always happen the way you imagine it will. Sometimes it doesn't happen dramatically. There's no speech that fixes it. There's no moment where the person who diminished you stands up and corrects the record for every room they've told the wrong version in. Sometimes what happens is quieter than that, and more permanent. Sometimes what happens is a man like Dr. Harlan Voss simply says what is true, in a room full of the people who needed to hear it because the truth was available the whole time and required only one person willing to say it out loud. And sometimes the thing that finally liberates you is not their acknowledgement at all. It's the moment you realize you stopped needing it without fully noticing when that happened. I flew back to Vancouver on a Sunday morning. The flight left at 6:40, and the city was still dark when the cab pulled out of the hotel. I had my laptop open before we reached altitude, the updated containment parameters for the Nunavut expansion pulled up on one screen, the Monday briefing notes on the other. Somewhere below me, Ottawa was waking up. My father was probably already in his kitchen, making the particular strong coffee he had always made, reading the news on his tablet. My mother was probably doing whatever she did in the mornings, now that the performance of the dinner was over and the room had emptied out and there was no audience left to arrange. I looked at the data on my screen. 31 communities. Outbreak response times reduced by an average of 73%. 11 events in the past 2 years where the early alert had changed the trajectory of a potential outbreak in a community that had no hospital, no urgent care, no option except the protocol I had built from a database and a model, and 8 years of field work in places most people have never heard of. There is no award for that, no plaque in a hospital corridor with my name on it. No single visible moment you can point to and say, there, that is what she built. The work is invisible by design. The outbreak that doesn't happen leaves no record of itself. The hospital stay that never occurs doesn't appear in anyone's statistics. The family that doesn't receive the call they would have received 2 weeks later has no way of knowing that someone they will never meet sat in a field office in February calculating how to get the information to them faster. I did not need my mother to see it to know it was real. I had needed that once. I don't anymore. The city below the plane disappeared into cloud. I closed the briefing notes, opened the Nunavut data, and kept working. Because somewhere north of where I was flying, in a community reachable only by small plane, on a morning that was colder than anything I had grown up with, the system I had spent 8 years building was doing exactly what I had designed it to do, and it did not require anyone's applause to function. It did not require validation or acknowledgement or the approval of a woman in a silk blouse who had made up her mind about me before I had a chance to show her anything. It only required that I had done the work. I had done the work. That was always going to be enough, even before I understood that it was.